Mark Lewisohn, welcome to Fans on the Run.
Thank you. It's nice to be here. Nice to be on location and not staring into a screen.
Yeah.
I'll tell people where we are. We're in the Hyatt Regency Jersey City Hotel in Jersey City, right across the Hudson from the lower part of Manhattan, and we're here for the weekend of the Fest for Beatles fans. And that's why we're doing this in person, because I'm here to do a presentation and you're here to do interview with me and just to meet lots of lovely people.
Yeah, I've made a lot of friends doing the show that sadly I haven't gotten the chance to meet in person.
Right.
So meeting all these people like Bruce Spicer and others.
Yes.
First, I'm kind of going to go back to the beginning.
Right.
When did you first become aware of the Beatles?
1963, when I was four going on 5. I turned 5 in June of that year, and you couldn't not hear about the Beatles in 1963 in the UK because they were all pervasive, and they were in the news constantly from, say, September, October onwards, and their music was everywhere, and I heard it. And when I heard it, I had the same experience as millions of other people all around the world. To this day, when they hear the Beatles for the first time, they're intrigued, excited. Their day is brightened. Their life is lightened. Their soul is lifted. It's all true, isn't it? I mean, this is the effect that they had on people then and still, and that's a miracle in itself. And so I just became hooked from a child, and that's it.
So in this period, were you buying the singles as they came out?
Well, I didn't I didn't have access to money other than a little bit of pocket money, which wouldn't have bought records, but it was an obvious gift for me. Whenever anybody wanted to buy me something, they could buy me a Beatles record. But I didn't have a complete collection, and it wasn't until the 1970s that I actually had everything. But the first, I think I got EPs before I got singles. And then I got, my first LP was Sgt. Pepper, which I did buy with my own money soon after its release, but I don't exactly recall when.
That's a good record to start off your collection.
Oh, well, it's still probably my favourite Beatles album, although that's always a hard one to call because it changes on a daily basis.
Careful around that topic. We'll approach it later.
All right, but yeah, Sgt. Pepper is a deeply magical record, and it made the greatest of impressions on me. There hadn't been anything like that before, but I certainly, in my very inexperienced young life, hadn't heard anything remotely like it. And I used to sit cross-legged on the floor with the record playing on our little mono LP. With
like the Dansette?
Well, it was Bush, actually. Dansette has become the name that everyone says, oh, we had a Dansette. Dansette was one of many brands.
I have to be careful here because I don't want to step on Mark Ellen and David Hepworth's toes.
Right. Well, they got quite big feet, so don't worry.
You heard it here first.
Yeah. No, it was just a magical LP to sit cross-legged on the floor and have it open on my lap, either at the gatefold looking at the picture or the back cover which had the words. And there hadn't been an LP with words before, but I didn't know that because I hadn't any previous LPs anyway. But to just be able to listen to it and read the words and just be swept away into the magical land that was that album, that's a feeling that will be with me for all my life.
How did the Summer of Love affect you personally as a youngster?
Well, let's see. I was 8 going on 9. I turned 9 in the month that Pepper came out, and so the only drugs I was doing was probably junior aspirin if I had a cold. I wasn't smoking. I was at primary school. I remember the year because I got seriously into the Beatles that year, as opposed to earlier when I really did like them but would only pick up things as I could. 67 was the year, just as I was getting older, when I could start to buy things for myself, and I started to get the Beatles Monthly magazine, and I joined the fan club, I think at the beginning of 68.
Well, you just kind of stumbled onto something I wanted to ask you about.
Yeah.
Your first kind of foray into the world of Beatle writing was you wrote into Beatle Monthly to get a pen pal.
Yeah. I just needed to see my name in the Beatles Monthly. It was one of those, how do I get my name in this magazine? And I don't actually know psychologically why that was important to me, but it was. And the easiest method, I mean, I did send letters for publication, but they were not selected, and they were probably for good reason. I don't even remember what they were. But they had this pen pal page, and if you wrote requesting a pen pal, your name would appear with your address. And I'm in there twice in, what must it be, late 1968, early 69, something like that. I was 10 and a half, and I made a great play on half, because that's much more important than being 10 when you're 10 and a half.
I'm 19 and a half.
Right, okay. I mean, I'd like to be asking you lots of questions, actually, since you're only 19 and a half and you're doing this, but maybe that's another time, I don't know.
Well, you know my number.
Well, okay. It's endlessly interesting to me how people get into the Beatles.
Boy, do I have the podcast for you.
Okay, well, I was talking at a literary festival, kind of the first literary festival since we've begun to emerge from our hideaway. And afterwards I was signing some books, and a young woman came up to me and asked me she bought Tune In and asked me to sign it. And I said to her, "How old are you?" And she said, 18. And I said, "Well, when did you get into the Beatles?" And she said, "From Get Back, from watching the Peter Jackson Get Back trilogy." And I just suddenly realised that's another gateway. You know, people got into them through the anthology or whatever. Now they're getting into them through Get Back. Mm-hmm. It's incredible how people are still coming in.
It's like seeing another, benchmark. Yeah. Because the last one was probably 09 with the remasters.
Maybe. I know the anthology was a big platform for a new tranche of fans to come through, but and Get Back, and I hadn't thought about that. I absorbed Get Back, as we all did, but I hadn't actually considered that it might be triggering a new generation of fans. And clearly, well, this I only met one, but she won't be the only one.
I'm going to get this out of the way, just so I don't do it through the rest of the show. What kinds of other music were you listening to as a youngster in the 60s?
I liked a lot of pop music in those days. Beatles were always top, but I still have some of the singles I bought then, and I had quite good taste, I would say, modestly. I bought in 1967 Waterloo Sunset by the Kinks. Purchases in those days when you're young, they're really meaningful. Mm-hmm. You have to save for them. It's not disposable income, it's very considered spending.
A rather grown-up record.
It's a magical record, and I still play it often, a couple of times a week. And it means something to me as a Londoner as well. Which I recognised instantly as a child. It was a London that I knew, and I would say that and Penny Lane are two of the most extraordinary songs ever in pop music, and they came out in a relatively short space of time.
Well, for me it's kind of a bit surface level, but I live in a town called Waterloo, so that the songs always kind of hit a special spot.
Well, yes, it would be.
Get to the end of the 60s,
the
Beatles have broken up. Your name has appeared in Beatles Monthly.
Yes.
How do you what is your progression as a fan to the point where you want to write about them?
A couple of quiet years. I was still following the Beatles, but didn't get the albums. Didn't have All Things Must Pass till about 75, and Imagine till about 75. So I was buying singles more than LPs still. Probably because of that was the limit of my spending power. I was an early Wings fan. I bought all the Wings singles, but I also had other interests that diverted my attention to a degree. But I think I was back into them big time by about 74-5, and I had left school by then and was working for the BBC in London. And I discovered on the first day I was at the BBC that it had its own reference library. And I'd always loved going to libraries and looking things up and finding things. and I was browsing the shelves in the BBC's internal use only reference library. It was there for program makers. If they wanted to make a program, they could go and do their research within the BBC and not have to go out. And there on the shelf in the music section, which wasn't particularly, not the pop music section anyway, it was not particularly extensive, was All Together Now by Harry Castleman and Wally Podrazik. And as a member of staff, I just showed my staff card and borrowed the book for 3 weeks, and then I just kept extending it and extending it and extending it. That book wasn't back on the shelf for about a year. I would just phone up and say, can I extend that book again? And that opened my eyes to a whole realm of Beatles knowledge that I didn't have any sense of. It was discographical, but it was more than that. It opened the world, the Beatles world, in a way that I hadn't
It's not
experienced.
quite like the Hunter Davies and the books in the 60s.
Yeah.
It's kind of the first step in taking it to a new level.
Absolutely. It was the first step of the Beatles had gone, but what did they leave behind? What exactly did they do while they were with us? I had read Hunter Davies. I was a great, passionate devotee of Apple to the Core.
Yeah.
By McCabe and Schoenfeld, and I love Lennon Remembers, and I love Derek Taylor's As Time Goes By. And then Roy Carr and Tony Tyler's Beatles An Illustrated Record was another huge influence on my life.
As a graphic designer, it's a big influence in what I do.
Right. It's a beautiful book. Its conception is wonderful. Its content is fantastic. So these things were all starting to happen at the same time. And also in that period, 1976, the Beatles Monthly magazine, in which I'd had my name as a 10-and-a-half-year-old, relaunched. And I was getting that. And then when I won a quiz at Britain's first Beatles convention, London's first Beatles convention, not Britain's, but London's first, which I won principally through my knowledge of All Together Now by Harry and Wally, I offered my services to the magazine for anything they might need me for, and I was 18 years old, and they said, yeah, actually we have a use for you. And because the magazine had relaunched, and frustrated fans who had questions but that couldn't find answers to them were writing to the magazine saying, can you answer this question that's been bugging me for years? And they turned their letters over to me, and I would pick a few that were suitable for publication, write the responses, and then it would be Johnny Dean says, Johnny Dean replies. And
so you were the resident anorak.
Yeah, I guess so. From 18, and they paid too, £1 a letter.
Were you working for the Radio Times at this time?
No, for the BBC.
Okay.
Oh no, yes. Well, you would think they're one and the same. No, I was in clerical positions in the BBC. By then, where was I? I was probably working at the film studios at Ealing, which was a great place to work.
Oh. So, you were working at the BBC in the 1970s,
yeah,
where legendarily,
yeah,
the BBC doesn't exactly have the best track record of keeping their material.
Yeah.
Do you have any memories of that time of, stuff being wiped and junked?
Oh, well, I was nowhere near that department that would have handled that. No, I was in finance, particularly when I was in at the film studios. And then after that, when I went to Radio News, I was still in finance. So, no, I had nothing to do with anything like that. I would say, since you brought the subject up, that the BBC is always unfairly attacked for its wiping policy, because the inference is that the BBC was this negligent organisation that had placed no value on our cultural history, whereas in fact all broadcasters wiped.
Yeah.
All broadcasters. In America, in every country of the world, and even within Britain, the commercial channel, ITV, they were wiping too. It was a necessity.
Yeah. It was, purely to, save space, reuse tape.
Yes, it was all those things.
It wasn't done out of,
Yeah.
It wasn't done with malicious intent.
It wasn't, and it's amazing how much actually does survive.
Yeah.
I mean, in terms of the Beatles, almost everything survives. There are certain key broadcasts that don't,
Yeah.
but most things do. Yeah.
And to be frank, I'm sure that some of the stuff we think is missing is out there in private hands.
Things are turning up all the time. In Britain, there's this campaign called Missing Believed Wiped, where people who find things in their attics or cellars or whatever, and they're not quite sure what it is, it's a film can or it's an early videotape or whatever, can return it to this organisation called Kaleidoscope, and they will find out what's on it, and things are turning up all the time.
Yeah. It was not too long ago, I was on YouTube and I found someone had recorded the screen with their like 8mm camera.
Yeah.
And it was what was the band? The Alan Bown.
Right.
Doing
yes.
I think it was We Can Help You.
Yes. Well, I mean, the Beatles, paperback writer, the last time they were on Top of the Pops, in fact the only time they were live in the studio along with all the other acts, because they'd been on the show before but they pre-recorded, was June 66, my birthday in 66, June 16. They did Paperback Writer and Rain, and the BBC didn't keep it. But a couple of years ago it turned out that when it was repeated the following Christmas 66, someone had their home movie camera trained on the screen, and there's Paperback Writer, and it's most of it, it's not all of it, but it's been synced up now. And so that even that has turned up in a way.
So kind of moving a bit forward, going into the 80s now. I think you had mentioned during a panel at the last Beatle Fest that you had helped with the research for the Philip Norman book.
Yes.
Shout.
Yes, I did. What
was that like?
It was good. It was an important stepping stone for me. Philip Norman now likes to say he discovered me, and okay, if that's what he wants to think, he can think it. I appreciate the fact that he did a lot for me, and that he definitely, through knowing Philip, doors did open for me, and I've never been afraid to acknowledge that. As a book, I think Shout is incredibly flawed, but at that time I was less discerning. I think we all were, and we were all taken in by how wonderful the book was, which I certainly don't think it is anymore. But Philip Norman was a big stepping stone for me, and I was always grateful for that. He asked me to do some particular research, and it was in a sense those things that really got me started on the path. I fulfilled the request that he had of me, and then when he said thank you very much, that's all I need, I just kept going.
Yeah. Not
for him, but for myself.
And so is this where the time of the Beatles live comes from? Yeah,
because either Philip asked me or I offered, I can't recall which it was, but it was clear that the date that Lennon met McCartney had been told differently, and in the few places it was published, it was different in each one, and so there was no defined date. It simply wasn't known. And maybe he asked me, or maybe I said I'll see if I can find it. But I went off in pursuit of the detail, and I'd always wanted to do research. In fact, the library where I did that research for Philip was it's gone now. The building's demolished, but it was in North London in a place called Colindale, where my parents had grown up, and I knew the area, and this library had fascinated me from childhood. And I'd been very frustrated as a 14-year-old wanting to go there when they said you have to be 21. So it turned out that when I met Philip Norman, I was 21 that year, and when he asked me to do this research, I thought, I'm going to go to that library at Colindale. And off I went, and there was the answer waiting to be found. And it was a thrilling moment, and it's my life from that moment to this day, and hopefully for many years still to come, is full of thrilling moments of discovery in libraries.
Speaking of discoveries in libraries, there's two books I kind of want to talk to you in particular. Yeah. Because there's the Beatles Recording Sessions book, which I can assume it was pretty straightforward. You go to Abbey Road, you listen to what's there, you write down what's there. But I'm quite curious about the Beatles live, and the Complete Beatles Chronicle in particular.
Yes.
What did the research process for those two look like?
The live book was my first book, and that came out in '86, so I was 28.
Came with a beautiful flexi disc.
Yeah, that was well, along the way while I was researching it, I learned about this man called Monty Lister, who had been was a broadcaster, and not exactly a professional broadcaster, but he had a job in something else, but he liked to do hospital radio. He did eventually broadcast on the BBC in Liverpool. Hospital radio, which was the early days of closed circuit, or I don't exactly know mechanically how it was done, but if you were a patient inside a hospital, there would be a little panel by your bed that would enable you, with a pair of headphones, that would enable you to listen to the BBC and 2 or 3 stations, and one of the buttons would be for the hospital's own radio station, and people would come around the wards, and I did this later in my life when I was about 20. You would go around and talk to the people in their beds, cheer them up a bit, give them a bit of company, and say, is there any record that you would particularly like to hear, because we'll play it for you on the radio station. And or if you've got a friend in another ward, you can dedicate a record to your friend. And so there was exclusive content for the patients of those hospitals only, and therefore the listening audience would have been not much more than a couple of hundred maybe. Yeah. But the Beatles did an interview for a hospital radio station on the Wirral opposite Liverpool, over the water from Liverpool. Funnily enough, one of the hospitals they did it for is the hospital where George's mother died. So she would have been listening to the hospital radio station a few years later when she was a patient there. And the Beatles and it was their first ever interview. And the man who did it, Monty Lister, had kept the tape. And once I got to know about it and hear about it, I bought the tape from him exclusively and the copyright, and knew what I wanted to do with it, which was to press it as a record and include it with my first book. Because I'd loved flexi discs as a child, because the Beatles fan club Christmas discs were very special when they used to arrive in the mail every December. But the book was it was the first indication that when you're a researcher and whatever your topic is, you go where you need to go with it. You don't limit yourself to particular places of research, because you have to keep an open mind as a researcher as to where you might find what it is that you need to know. And so the bulk of the book was done using that same library, because what I did was I looked at the newspapers for the whole of Britain for the years of 1961, 2, 3. Had the Beatles turned up in this town? Was there an advertisement for a dance that they were playing? Because they used to play dances, really, not concerts. They would be in the local ballroom on a Thursday night, and then that was it. They may never return to that town. So it was an exhaustive process, but it rooted me in what it was I was doing. But then there was the challenge of finding out the dates they played that hadn't been advertised, and that meant tracking down old promoters, or people who had kept diaries, who had been to see shows, or people who had collected memorabilia like handbills or posters or something like that. So you just did what you needed to do to find out. And I knew that I wasn't finding everyone they'd ever done, but it was a good attempt at getting it all down. And I'm still learning of 1 or 2 a year dates come up that I didn't know about before.
Do you ever plan on doing a revised version?
Well, the things I learned between that publication in '86 and the publication of the Complete Chronicle in '92 were added to the Chronicle. Okay. So that one does have some more dates in it than the live book did. But I've learned the Chronicle itself is 30 years ago now, so they're still turning up. I don't know. My time is thoroughly occupied now with writing the trilogy, so I don't know that I'm going to revisit.
You're writing the trilogy?
Yeah, a trilogy.
Yeah.
I don't know that I'm going to revisit those earlier books, but eventually my entire archive will be available through a library somewhere, and hopefully ultimately through the internet, and then people can see everything.
Mm-hmm. So kind of you touched on something, looking in places where people might not normally go.
Yeah.
What is, if you can recall, the strangest circumstance that you have found, fairly important information about?
Oh. I really don't know the answer to that. I don't know. I mean, initially for those years, I was researching facts. And although I'm still researching facts, I'm now researching colour. Because the books I'm writing aren't... Those early books were all list books. And now I don't do list books now. I do narratives. So you need more than lists. You need to provide the colour that goes on top of the bedrock of detail. So I keep an absolutely open eye and open ears and open mind to everything. But this is not an answer to your question, is it? I still don't know what the answer is. Maybe it'll come to me. It
doesn't have to be the chronicle. It could be research you've done for these.
Yes.
Trilogy.
Well, okay. Well, with Tune In, for example, many of the listeners to this podcast will know the name Frida Kelly.
Yes.
Good old Frida, lovely woman who was secretary of the fan club from. The beginning of '63, I would say, to until it closed down in '72. Good old Frida. My annual membership card used to come from Frida, and she was this special name that, and still is a special person. Many of the people listening to this will know her, and I'm sure agree with that. But she would be the first to say she didn't start the fan club. Before her was a woman called Roberta Brown. Bobby Brown, and I was always intent on finding Bobby Brown because when she started the club, she was really close to the Beatles because they hadn't yet broken out of Liverpool, so she was seeing them a lot. Whereas when Frida was secretary, she was in Liverpool and they were in London, so she didn't see them that often. It took me years to find Bobby Brown, and when I found her, she still had a lot of papers, and I had photocopies of some old papers that she didn't have, and we sat down and went through all these papers together, and out tumbled all these stories, fantastic stories that I'd never heard before, all of which were true, all of which passed my bullshit detector without any difficulty whatsoever. But she hadn't even started it. There was actually, before her, there was a young lad and two young girls who had started the fan club, and I thought, I've got to find them as well. There's some great stories here, but I'll just talk about the two young girls. The problem with finding women is typically that their surname changes with marriage, and that makes researching their whereabouts much, much harder. If all you've got is the name of a girl in 1962, how do you find her in 2010? But there are ways, and I'm pretty indefatigable, and I eventually tracked down
Where's
one.
The word for the day?
Indefatigable, yeah. First one and then the other. And as I talked to them both, so it came out that for a brief while, in a way, they had actually also managed the Beatles. We know about Alan Williams, and then we know about Brian Epstein, but in between there were these two girls. And I should remember their names, Jennifer and... God, bloody hell, I have to look at my own book.
Tune in, you can find it in
stores.
Yes,
pause while I look at my own book. I don't retain everything I've written. Once I've written it, I kind of, in a sense, discharge it. But anyway, these two girls, Maureen O'Shea and Jennifer. Someone, it's dribbling back. They had managed the Beatles for a little while in a completely ineffectual way, which is why they never got mentioned even by the Beatles. The Beatles never said that they had two girls managing them, but they did, and they were actually asked to do it by Jim Mack, Paul's dad, because they used to go and sit with him and he used to make them tea, or they used to make him sandwiches and things like that. All real lovely, close family stuff. So that was a great treat. And also I ended up meeting the fellow as well, who was with them, Bernie Boyle, and there's a great story right there, but unless you want me to go into it, if you want to move on, we can move on. But
Well, now I'm intrigued.
Well, Bernie was someone who hung around the Beatles a lot in '62. He was one of those young kids who befriended them, and the Beatles befriended him. They liked having him around. The Beatles were always open-minded to having people around, if they didn't make a nuisance of themselves.
That's kind of evident even through Get Back.
Absolutely.
Our boys attracted a lot of coattail riders.
But well, if these people overstepped their welcome, or if they misbehaved in any way, they would be told gently or otherwise that they weren't welcome. But if you were okay, if you weren't making a nuisance of yourself, the Beatles were always happy to have you around. And Bernie used to be one of those guys who George would say, "Here, carry my guitar in," and then you're in. So I'm with the band, and carries the guitar in. And he'd started the fan club with these two girls, Maureen and Jennifer. And I knew he'd been around the Beatles quite a bit in '62 and would have some interesting things to say, but he'd never been spoken to by any author, and he hadn't volunteered himself to anybody. There was nothing about him on the internet. And I tried everything to find Bernie Boyle, and though I am indefatigable, I kept coming to the end of the line and thinking, I don't know how else I can find this man. Well, in cut to 2005, I was in New York, and Neil Aspinall, may he be resting in peace, I'd approached Peter Brown, who had in a sense blotted his copybook with his book The Love You Make in 1983, but I knew he was an important man for me to interview nonetheless. And Neil Aspinall, I got in touch with Peter and he said, "I'll let you know," and he and Neil were still close, and Neil said, "Mark's okay, you can see Mark won't let you down,
he won't bite."
Yeah, won't bite, but also won't rip you off, won't cheat on you, won't do the dirty on you. You have to honour the people that you interview. And
I hope I'm honouring you.
So far, so good.
Yeah, well, there's still time.
yeah. And so Peter said, "Come up and see me when you're in New York," and I was in his apartment on Central Park West, and this was our introductory getting to know you session. And I then had about 15 interviews with Peter. I still interview Peter from time to time. And he said, I got there like 3:00 and it was 4:30, and he said, we're going to have to finish soon because I'm expecting a visitor at 5. And I went, oh, okay, fine, no problem. Nice to meet you. We'll talk again. Fine, yeah, okay. And I said, he said, "Funnily enough, this guy's from Liverpool." "Oh, really? Oh, that's funny. What's his name?" "Bernie." And I went, "What's his surname?" "Boyle." And I said, "Hang on a minute. Is this the Bernie Boyle who used to be around Brian and Nems and the Beatles and all that?" He said, "Yeah, that's right." And I went, "I've been looking for him for years, and he's about to ring the doorbell and come into this room." Okay. And so I said, "Do you mind if I hang around? Because I need to meet Bernie." So I met Bernie, and he lives in LA, and I went to see him in LA and got a brilliant interview from Bernie, who told me wonderful stories from 1962, all of which are bang on true and wonderful, full of colour and life and vigour and Beatles' personality and character. And I knew he was important, but I didn't know how important. And I still remain the only person who's interviewed him. I don't know why, but he's out in the open now, and he's a fantastic guy. He stayed in the music business, and he went into tour management, and about 15 years ago, I don't know what year it was, maybe 2005, there was a Paul toured America, and Bernie was on the crew. And Bernie's dead cool, Liverpool guy, and very laid back, and didn't make a fuss, didn't say, "I know Paul McCartney," or anything like that. And they were literally backstage at the first gig, and Paul and Bernie are walking towards each other, but they're going to walk past each other because Bernie isn't still going to say anything to Paul. And Paul literally walks past Bernie and stops and that guy from somewhere. And turns around and goes, is it Bernie? And this was like, 2005. They hadn't seen each other since 1963. Paul has lived the life of a king in that period and still remembered Bernie and his name, which is incredible, but typical Paul. And they hugged, and it was a beautiful reunion. And these are great stories. I just love this. My intention in everything I do is to make the Beatles human, not megastars, but human, because they're just guys who've had an extraordinary time.
Speaking about the Beatles just being guys, so mid-'80s, you start to work in a more official capacity with the Beatles. Yeah. And I want to know, what were your first impressions of meeting them as people, rather than mythical, four-headed monster?
Yeah. Paul was the first one I met, and the only one I met with any regularity. And
because you ran clubs,
eventually I was editing his newspaper Club Sandwich for his fan club. Fun club. But I had many dealings with Paul. The very first time I met him was at the Buddy Holly Week party in 1986, and Bill Harry was there, funnily enough, and I knew Bill quite well. And Paul likes to. His way of coping with meeting with so many people in his life, his mechanism, and it's a good one, is to kind of put people into boxes. And so I went into this box of this young lad who knows a lot about me, knows a lot about my career. Could be an interesting guy to have around, but may need to be told to calm down occasionally. And Bill, who obviously he knew as the editor of Mersey Beat from 1961, and so being that we were both there, he kind of it's like, I'm with the two experts here, kind of thing, which I was a little bit. I wasn't entirely comfortable with him saying that or thinking that, but it was. But anyway, you accept it, don't you? You accept it. Just to be acknowledged by the man is, a wonderful thing. So, the reason I was there was because he loved the Beatles live, and one of the reasons he loved the Beatles live is because he hated Peter Brown's book, and he hated Philip Norman's book, and he hated the pro-Lennon, anti-McCartney slant that had taken place in literature post John's assassination. And my book didn't go near any of that. It was simply a diary of his youth, where he had been, and when you're living that life, it's a blur. My book told him where he had been, all the places they had played and when, and the order of events that had led to their rise. And it had anecdotes in it that he and Ringo loved. For example, when the Beatles played in Preston in September 63, and after the show Paul drove 25 miles to judge a beauty contest, and for a couple of years after that book came out, they would always talk about that in interviews. We were busy, and Paul would judge a beauty contest, after the gig. And that all came from that book, and so because there had been all these books that Paul had hated, and my book was suddenly one that he didn't hate and was just useful to him. He could look things up and see where he had been. He offered me a job, which was to help him write his autobiography. And that was, so I went under contract with Paul in 87.
His autobiography.
It never happened.
Yeah, I was going to say, what happened there? If you're allowed to say.
Yeah, I think the headline answer is he changed his mind. Yeah.
He's human.
Yeah, he just changed. It was a good idea for a time, and then he changed his mind and didn't do it. I mean, as a creative artist, and there are a few more creative than Paul, if anybody, he's always got so many other things going on. It seemed like a good idea when he had it in 87, and then by 89 he's, Flowers in the Dirt is out, he's on the road again, he's got a kind of permanent band, and he's I don't want to do my autobiography now, I'm busy. That's how it was. Yeah, I did kind of put him off it as well a little bit as well, unfortunately, because I was asked to write a document containing the essence of what his autobiography should be, what its aims should be, how thorough it should be, how big it should be, how much time it would likely take if he did do it. And my belief is always you've got to do the very, very best job that you possibly can. And my love of Paul McCartney has always been that only the best will do for this man. And therefore I said to him, look, in all the work you've ever done, you've led the way. Typically, showbiz autobiographies, showbiz memoirs, they're okay. They're not that good. They're often ghost-written. They're not that good. They're typically tossed off fairly quickly. Your book should absolutely set the benchmark for how brilliant an autobiography should be, and then people will always say that was the book, that was the best book ever, that Paul McCartney autobiography. So I put all this down in the document, and I think he read it and just went, oh my God, I'm not going to do all that, that's going to take years. And so I probably put him off.
So what about the other two, George and Ringo? What were your dealings with them?
Ringo, pretty much nothing. He referred to me in a podcast radio interview a couple of years ago as Mark Lewisohn. So he doesn't even know how to say my name. Not much with Ringo. Very little. Nothing to speak of. George, checkered.
There's the one quote that you have said in interviews. There's you weren't the.
Yeah. I've had mixed times with George. George was kept a low profile through the first half of the 1980s. He was busy with handmade films. He wasn't making music. He didn't do interviews unless it was talking about handmade films.
It seemed that George had a bit of a spotty relationship with Beatle biographers.
Oh yes, well George always had an absolute distrust of all books about the Beatles.
There's one in particular that comes to mind, but I've vowed not to say his name on the show.
Okay, well, yeah, I mean, you could understand why he felt burned by the few people who he'd allowed to get relatively close, or one in particular. But George's family background was such that you would allow certain things in your life to be seen, and those things were okay, but you didn't want people delving into what else you were doing. Your private life was your private life, and no one really had any right to know about it. And so any authors or journalists had always been, George's attitude to journalists goes right back to, well, as I say in Tune In, it goes back to 1958 when he was 14 years old, and it was mentioned in the local newspaper and the facts were wrong. And he probably thought right from that point on that journalists always get things wrong, and he had ample evidence to support that in the 60s. But in 1987 he was re-emerging and with Cloud9, and he would do one British newspaper interview, and I got in touch with the Observer newspaper, the serious Sunday newspaper in Britain, the Observer, and said, if I can get a George Harrison interview, will you run it? And they said, yes, we'll make it the cover of our colour magazine. And so when I approached him through his record company for an interview, it wasn't for Beatles Monthly, it was for the Observer. And this was presented to George, and he wanted to be in the Observer, and he wanted to be on the cover of the colour supplement, but Mark Lewisohn, isn't he that Beatles guy? So what I heard was that he asked Neil Aspinall what I was like, and Neil said, Mark's okay, he's sensible, he's not stupid. And then he asked Derek Taylor, and I knew both these guys by then, and Derek said to him, no, Mark's okay, he's not going to be screaming at you, he's just going to be asking you questions. So on that basis, George said yes, and I got to meet him, and I interviewed him for the Observer, and it was a good interview, and in fact I had two sessions with him. because the first session he was running very, very late, and I went down to Shepperton Film Studios to interview him because that's where Handmade had its base, and he was running very, very late, and so late in fact that by the time he had finished the previous interview there was no time for my interview. And I was also with Mark Ellen as well, who was interviewing him for Q, I think it must have been. And
Q or Smash Hits or
no, Q by 87. So he said, I can't see you today, guys. We're going to have to rearrange. But should we go to the pub? So, okay, George, let's go to the pub. So Shepperton is a film studio, a big lot. There's a pub on the lot, but you could be half a mile from it. And George had his Mercedes there, so we climbed into George's car and he drove us round to the pub. And we went in the pub, and She Loves You was playing on the jukebox as we walked in, and he turned to me and said, I suppose you arranged this.
Did you?
Yes, I had arranged it. And I Want to Hold Your Hand was going to follow if we walked in just a couple of minutes later.
Yeah.
So we sat there, and we were just having, and George had a pint of brown, which is a good kind of British working class man's pint, which was great to see, and I had a pint of bitter, and I was sitting in the pub with George, and of course everyone's going, it's George Harrison, and some guy came up to George and said, excuse me, George, can I have your autograph? And he signed it, and then he looked at me and said, shall I do the other guys? And I went, yeah. And so he did Paul McCartney, John Lennon and Ringo Starr, and he did them well, and he turned them to me and said, would that pass muster at Sotheby's? And I went, I think it would. They were good. I mean, they all used to know each other's autographs, and this was 1987. I don't know when he'd previously done it.
That's one of my personal collector holy grails. So I want a set of Beatle autographs, but not like an actual set, like something that Mal Evans or Neil Aspinall or one of them wrote. Yes, yeah.
You can get all the sets now. In fact, I've seen it laid out in a PDF of all the Beatles autographs by Paul, all the Beatles autographs by George, all the Beatles autographs by John, all the autographs by Neil and Mal and Tony Bramwell and others around. So that was all great, and I got on great with George, and the interview was rescheduled for his office in London. I had a couple of hours with him there. We got on fine. He signed the Beatles live. He said how much he liked it, which was great, and I felt I was in. But then I started to work for Paul, and Paul and George were not getting on in those days at all. George was always winding Paul up, and Paul was always getting annoyed by George. And the fact that I was working for Paul, George said to Brian Roylance when he heard that I was going to work for Paul, I hope Paul looks after him, which was a nice thing to say. But then the one who didn't look after me from that point on was George, who just turned. And the next time I saw him in 92, he was really unpleasant. Yeah.
That's sad.
Yeah. And nothing had happened in between to make that happen, but he had turned. And from that point on, that was it. Because once George made up his mind about something, that was it.
Yeah. Kind of also sticking with the, your duties in an official capacity. What was the state of Apple like when you started working, with the Beatles?
It was small. The first time I met Neil, I went into Apple in '83. I was researching the Beatles live, and Brian Epstein used to issue weekly sheets to the Beatles showing where their coming week's engagements were, and also on the back or on the separate document would be the accounts for the part of the week that's just finished, showing all the places they'd played. So there's a huge amount of information in these sheets, and when I was writing the book, I thought, God, I need to find as many of these sheets as I can because they've got the ultimate of information in them. And I had half a dozen of them, and they had been weekly for a couple of years. So I thought maybe Neil had kept some. So I wrote a letter to him, and he said, come in for a meeting. And I went in to see him, and just stepping into Apple was a thrill. 1983. And it was Neil and an accountant and a secretary, and that was it.
So it wasn't quite the glory days of Savile Row.
No, it was in St James's Street, not far from there. Apple had moved around a few places, but it was just wonderful to be in Neil's office, and the phone rang, and it was Richie. And he had about a 10-minute conversation with Richie while I was just sitting there waiting for him to finish. And Neil was a fascinating man. He used to pace the room when he spoke. He had a phone with an extraordinarily long lead that would enable him to walk the entire room while speaking on the phone. And so he was walking all around the room with this very long lead trailing behind him. Yeah. I don't know how he got a lead that long. It must have been made specially for him. But he couldn't help me. But I made a relationship with Neil that day that always stood me in good stead. And then from the mid-80s, Derek was back at Apple on an ad hoc basis, and I got to meet Derek. And Derek and I, well, everyone who ever met Derek fell in love with the man, and I was certainly no exception to that. But he reciprocated by being fond of me, and he did become a friend. He actually did become a friend. I wouldn't say I was friends with Neil, but we liked each other. But Derek was a friend, and so I was in, which is why they both put in a good word for me with George, and why when George turned against me, they both tried to stop him. But as Derek said to me, you can't change George's mind. Once George has made up his mind, that's it. So yeah,
from that period of time, even though like the books you've written have been invaluable to Beatle history, I think your biggest contribution to the Beatles is Past Masters.
Do you really think so?
Well, it's still in print, isn't it?
It's still in print, but the bastards took my name off it.
The
2009 reissue was the first time I knew that I was no longer quite as welcome at Apple as I used to be.
Fuckers.
Yeah, they took my name off it.
Well, never mind.
Yeah.
I have the 88 one with your name in the gatefold.
Yeah.
And I also have I don't know what the official name is, looks like a bread box, the box set from the 80s.
Yeah.
And you wrote the liner notes.
Yeah. Those were EMI projects, really. They weren't Apple projects, because the master tapes have always been owned by EMI. Mm-hmm. May EMI rest in peace as well. I had great relationships with everyone at EMI, and I was EMI's go-to guy for anything they were doing Beatle-wise from about 82 to the one album, which was when was the one album? 2003?
One was 2000 or 2000.
Was it 2000? Okay, that was I think the last thing I did the last thing I did was the first US box set in 2004.
Yeah.
But it had thinned out by then. I did the one album, and so everything in between. Well, not quite everything. I wasn't involved in the BBC albums, the Beeb albums. They weren't mine, but most other things were. And Past Masters was my idea. It wasn't. Someone would have come up with it if it wasn't me.
I mean, and the track listing, the Rarities album before.
Yeah, the track listing. Although I compiled it, it did kind of compile itself, which is probably why they took my name off it. But it was unnecessary for them to do that.
Yeah. Well, and I won't say his name, but now there's kind of a new guy, so to speak, who's kind of taken the position that you used to.
You mean Kevin? Kevin Howlett? Yeah.
I wasn't sure if I was allowed to say his name.
Oh, yeah, I'm friends with Kevin.
Yeah.
Well, I don't see him much these days, but we've worked together.
Yeah.
Yeah, Kevin and I know each other quite well. Yeah. More then than now, but yeah, we've always got along. And someone's got to do it. It's not going to be me. Someone's got to do it, and Kevin's perfectly good enough.
He's doing a bang-up job. Trying to think. Okay, I think I'm going to hit you with the quick-fire questions.
Fine.
All right.
So you want more quick-fire answers then than the long-winded ones that I've been giving you?
It doesn't matter.
All right.
If you've listened to my show, I always say, like, the quick-fire questions are quick. People make the answers long.
Okay.
What is your favorite Beatle album? And I think you've already said Sgt. Pepper.
Please Please Me.
Really?
Yeah. Who else says that? So that's why I'm saying it.
Okay.
Because it deserves to be said as well. It's a fantastic album.
Okay. So you're just...
I'm playing with it.
Okay.
I'm playing with it. It's as relevant as Abbey Road or the White Album or Rubber Soul or Revolver.
You know what? I didn't think it was possible. I respect you more.
Thank you. Please Please Me is a fantastic album. They didn't make a bad album.
A while ago I did up a bunch of kind of charts, statistic stuff for the first 50 episodes of the show, and I had tallied up what everyone says for like favorite album, least favorite album.
Right.
And Please Please Me was actually quite high on the list of least favorite.
Oh, least favorite. Yeah. Well,
I think it was second to Let It Be.
We've lived in a world for the last 40 to 50 years where the Beatles' second half of the career, the post-touring recordings, the Revolver, if you like, onwards, which isn't quite post-touring, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Pepper, White Album, Abbey Road, Let It Be, Yellow Sub, Magical Mystery Tour, they are considered to be the Beatles' key artistic years, and what precedes it is kind of diminished, because there is what I always consider to be that seesaw effect of if you promote something, naturally something else is going to be relegated. Mm-hmm. So as the seesaw goes up one side, it goes down on the other, and therefore everything that precedes Revolver is diminished because we're talking mostly about the later period. I don't buy that at all. With the Beatles is a magnificent album. A Hard Day's Night is a magnificent album. Beatles for Sale is a magnificent album.
Good. I'm glad you said.
It really is.
I'm glad you said that one in particular.
Yeah.
Because that one gets a lot of, it gets slagged off.
Roy Carr and Tony Tyler are responsible for that. They're the ones who set the tone on Beatles for Sale.
I think it's one of their better early records.
I couldn't place it high above A Hard Day's Night.
No.
I don't know if I could put anything above A Hard Day's Night, except Please Please Me with the Beatles, Sgt. Pepper, blah, blah, But they're all, this
you
is
can't place anything above the Beatles except for maybe the Beatles.
They are the ultimate in excellence in everything that they did, and it stands still as wonderful as it always was.
Now I'm going to make you walk back on that.
Yeah.
What's your least favourite Beatle album?
It probably has to be Yellow Submarine, because it's not much of a meal, is it? It's just a bit of a snack on side one. But I mean, the Beatles tracks on there are great. I'm fine, and I love them. But as an album, it's not the full deal, is it?
There's not a lot of meat on the bones.
No, because it's a film soundtrack and not an album. So I wouldn't even necessarily count it. I don't know, least favourite. I tend not to measure like that anyway. I mean, I just think that they're all outstandingly
it seems like you're less cynical than I am.
I'm not cynical at all, and they're just outstanding examples of artistic achievement, aren't they? They're just all magnificent. But more than that, that's all getting a bit heady about it. They're just wonderful to listen to.
Yeah.
You put them on and sing and dance to them, and that's really what it's about.
So, kind of piggybacking off of that, do you have a favourite Beatles song?
No.
That was quick.
No, it could be...
You're allowed to lie.
I'll just throw some titles out.
Okay.
All I've Got to Do, If I Fell, It Won't Be Long, Fixing a Hole.
You may be the first person who's mentioned All I've Got to Do specifically.
Oh, well, it's 100 out of 100. It couldn't be better. It's a magnificent song. It's a magnificent recording. It's just a magnificent vocal. The arrangement, it's just fantastic. If I Fell, I'm the Walrus, Penny Lane, of course.
I Fell was my dad's favourite.
Happiness is a Warm Gun, Hey Bulldog, Two of Us, Long and Winding Road, Let It Be. Tend to say those together. Eleanor Rigby, Michelle. I absolutely adore Michelle. And I Love Her. I'll Be Back. No Reply. Babies
I think I'm going to cut you off there.
Okay, I'll stop there.
Let's see if you can do it the other way around.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a least favorite Beatles song? One that could come on the radio and it's like, I don't want to hear this again. And it doesn't have to be a song you hate.
Yes.
It's just one of the ones you love the least.
don't need to hear it in that moment.
Yeah.
Maybe Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby.
Oh.
I love Carl Perkins' version. Beatles' version doesn't quite do it for me. But even that is perfectly fine. I could put that on without objection. But possibly if I guess radio is one method, but another method is if you're scrolling through your iTunes, if I play the Beatles catalogue on random, which I often do, on shuffle rather, if that comes on, I may just nudge the next button. May just nudge it. Yeah, possibly.
This may be a bit harder. So you're a Beatle author. You know a lot of Beatle authors. You've read a lot of Beatle books.
Yeah.
What are some of the, if you can be impartial, some of the better, lesser-known Beatle books that you think people should read?
Oh, wow.
And you can give, 3 or 4, if...
I don't know. I have, I think, a complete library of Beatles books. I buy them all, and I always have. But I don't have time to get familiar with all of them because they pour in, and I'm busy writing.
Yeah.
And the reading is actually, all my reading is to do with progressing my own work. It's not so much getting frustrated with the things I read in some other author's book that aren't quite as reaching the standards I think they should. But there are many, 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 many fine books on the Beatles, and many fine authors of books on the Beatles, particularly in America, where the depth of scholarship is particularly impressive. It's not exclusively so, because people everywhere have impressive scholarship, but American Beatle fans have, not all, but obviously I'm generalising, but some of the authors have done particularly fine work. Real proper research.
Well, the first one you were talking about as a major influence was All Together Now.
All Together Now, which definitely shaped my interest in the Beatles and encouraged me to want to pursue research. You know how when you're growing up, the music that you hear in your teens often lasts the longest. Yeah. After that, you're continually hearing music, but it's what you heard when
it's all coloured by that.
Yes, when you're 15, those are the tracks that really embed deeply. Well, so it is with Beatles literature. I couldn't praise Apple to the Core high enough. It's out of print now, but it's a great book. Similarly, anything by Derek Taylor. So as time goes by, 50 Years Adrift, which is hard to find because it was only a limited edition, expensive.
One of those, bajillion-dollar Genesis publications type deals.
Yeah, it was. What was it at the time it came out? £175 or something like that. It's pretty expensive,
yeah.
And it's sold out, and it hasn't been reprinted. But I reread it last year, and it's a joy. It's a deep, deep joy, because to know Derek was to love him, and if you love his writing style, and I certainly do, then that book is just crammed with Taylorisms, and it's a laugh-a-line.
Laugh-a-line,
yeah,
with Derek Taylor.
A laugh-a-line with Taylor. Roy Carr and Tony Tyler. I'm still talking 70s books, aren't I? The books by by the likes of John Wynne and Chip Madinger, mm-hmm. and
8 Arms to Hold You.
8 Arms to Hold You and the Lennonology. Bruce Spicer's books. I feel bad because I'm going to miss out some authors that I'm going to afterwards. I'm going to be thinking, I really should have said their book.
You can tell it to them in the hallway.
Yeah, many of them are here this weekend, and I'm looking forward to seeing them. Piers Hemingson's books on the Beatles in Canada. The point is, there are still areas where Beatles research can be done deeply that hasn't been done before. And the people I've described have taken a deep dive into a particular niche area, like Piers, The Beatles in Canada, 2 big books on that. It's anything you might want to know about the Beatles' impact on Canadians and the Canadian impact on the Beatles, such as it was, anything. It's all in that book.
If I even may be so big-headed, it's like I feel like I've kind of found my niche area of Beatle research.
Yes.
Where it's just about the fan perspective.
Yes.
Because I hadn't seen, podcasts really covering it before.
Yes.
And so I did.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And the podcasts have proliferated massively in the past couple of years.
It's a very saturated market.
But I mean, I'll bring this forward a bit. The Beatles now is a long time ago, and many of the people writing about the Beatles weren't born at the time, weren't there. I mean, it's not a necessity to have been there, which I argued with George once. But I do have a concern that books now and in the future are being written by people who, it's not so much that they weren't there, it's that they can't have, and it's not their fault, they can't have the understanding of the period of time in which these events took place, because they weren't alive then. Sometimes their parents weren't even alive then. And I feel that I can hear it and read it in the things that I see and hear, where people are just they've as the Eric Idle said in the Ruttles, they've picked up the wrong end of the stick
and now beat about the bush with it.
Precisely. And that's a concern of mine, that in a couple of 100 years' time, should mankind still be roaming the planet,
there's a great video with that concept.
Yeah.
It's like if we applied.
Yes, I think I know the one you mean. I've seen
Beatles in the year 3000.
Yeah.
Shea Stadium, 1965. The Beatles win the Super Bowl.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly that. It just gets more and more and more and more and more and more wrong, and I believe that process has started. I think the internet, which is obviously a phenomenal resource for people who want to look things up, is also full of complete rubbish about the Beatles.
Because anyone can just spout whatever they want as fact.
Yeah, and I've noticed it with reactions to Get Back, where I've heard people speak about Get Back, and I was watching the same thing they were, and okay, I'm not saying my point of view is the only valid one, far from it. But when I hear what people took from Get Back, how they interpreted a particular moment, I'm thinking, how did you see that? What people bring their own agenda to what they see.
One agenda that I've kind of seen as of late is this perpetuation of this theory of John and Paul being a bit more than just friends in some way, if you catch what
I hear what you're saying, yes. Yeah, well, that's been around on the internet for a few years now, hasn't it?
Yeah.
And someone's even morphed a photograph of where they're standing close to the microphone to actually show them kissing at the moment. Yeah, I mean, whatever.
It's rubbish.
Yeah.
And the last question I'd like to ask you, how would you like to see history portray the Beatles?
Accurately. Truthfully. Candidly. Honestly. But with no added bullshit. People should keep their own bullshit out of things. I'm trying to write the history before I die, 3 volumes that I hope will leave a legacy of truth about what really happened in those years. I certainly couldn't be working any harder on it, and I'm not introducing anything that isn't verifiable. But nonetheless, I do feel that the game is lost, I'm afraid. I mean, for example, the first volume, Tune In, came out 2013. It's coming up, it's 8.5 years ago now, and I'm still working on the second one. Tune In set a lot of things right about the early years. It really did set down what had occurred, and yet I still read, all to this day, vast amounts of stuff that are patently wrong about those years, when the writers of those pieces or the broadcasts, whatever, could be looking it up, but they're not. So even though the book is out there, I don't think it's really changing things. Maybe to some extent it is, but not as much as I would have hoped. And so therefore I think when volumes 2 and 3 come out, the same will happen. People who want to think that John and Paul were lovers will still think it. And they're probably going to think that I didn't put it in because I didn't want to put it in. But no, if I find that they're lovers, I should put it in. But I can tell you that I'm not going to find that they were lovers, because they were not. So yeah, but I'm doing my best. So that's all you can do, isn't it? We can only do our best.
And on that optimistic note,
yeah. Sorry about that. Ultra gloomy finish to your.
Oh, podcast. Don't worry. I'm not exactly a very cheery person myself.
I am, and I just get brought down by nonsense about the Beatles. But you can't control it, can you?
You can't.
Yeah.
Well, Mark, I just want to thank you for coming on the show. It's been a couple of years in the making, and I'm glad we were finally able to make it work.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.